Here's what you think you know about the 1920s. Glamour, jazz, champagne, and people dancing on rooftops while the good times rolled forever. You've seen the parties. You've seen the green light across the water. You've seen the Hollywood version, golden and gorgeous and doomed. The real world behind the Great Gatsby was far stranger, far more brutal, and in many ways, far more fascinating than anything F. Scott Fitzgerald put on the page. The wealth was real. So was the rot underneath it. The parties actually happened. And the people at those parties were living inside one of the most explosive, contradictory decades in American history. A decade that would end not in a blaze of champagne, but in the greatest economic collapse the modern world had ever seen. What you're about to discover is nothing like what Hollywood ever showed you. All visuals in this episode were recreated using artificial intelligence, based on real historical records, photographs, and period documentation. Now, let's go back. It's the summer of 1922, and we're going to follow 3 people into this world. The first is James. He's 27 years old, just arrived in New York from a small town in Minnesota, carrying 2 suitcases and a letter of introduction to a bond trading firm on Wall Street. He's not rich, not yet, but he believes with everything he has that he will be. That's what the city promises everyone who steps off the train at Grand Central and looks up at that cathedral ceiling for the first time. The promise isn't whispered, it's thundering. The second is Clara, a seamstress working in a garment workshop in Lower Manhattan, 23 years old, the daughter of Italian immigrants who arrived through Ellis Island 18 years ago. She earns $11 a week. She has never been to Long Island, but she's heard the music drifting across the radio from those houses on the water, and she knows, the way everyone knows, that there are people in this country living lives she can barely imagine. And the third is Walter, a bootlegger's driver. He's the one who actually knows where the champagne comes from. Together, they're going to take us through the real world of the 1920s. The world Fitzgerald knew firsthand, the one he poured into every page of The Great Gatsby. We start on the street. Before you understand the parties, you have to understand the city that made them possible. New York in 1922 is a city literally under construction. You can hear it before you can see it. The percussive rhythm of jackhammers on concrete. The screech of steel beams being hoisted 40, 50, 60 stories into the air. The shouts of workers in a dozen different languages echoing off canyon walls of limestone and brick. The smell hits you next. Coal smoke, horse manure still clinging to the cobblestones near the older streets, roasting chestnuts from corner vendors. And underneath it all, the metallic bite of the subway exhaust rising through grates in the sidewalk. The city smells like effort, like ambition with its sleeves rolled up. James walks through this every morning, and every morning it feels like a kind of electricity running up through the soles of his shoes. In purely physical terms, New York in the 1920s was the loudest city on earth. A Columbia University study in 1929 would find that noise levels in Midtown Manhattan regularly exceeded what we would today classify as hearing damage thresholds. The city didn't just buzz, it roared. The skyline itself was changing in real time. The Flatiron Building had been there since 1902, but the Chrysler Building wouldn't be finished until 1930. In between, a forest of mid-height towers was going up block by block, each one a monument to capital, to confidence, to the belief that America had finally become the most powerful nation on the planet, and that the proof of it could be measured in floors. James crosses Broadway at noon and feels it all. The promise, the pressure, both at once. To understand what the 1920s actually were, you have to understand what made them explode into being. The decade didn't arrive slowly. It arrived like a door blowing open. The Roaring Twenties were, in part, a direct psychological reaction to the First World War. Between 1917 and 1918, over 4 million Americans had been mobilized. more than 116,000 never came home. The ones who did return came back to a country that desperately, almost violently, wanted to forget and to feel. The grief was real. The need to drown it was just as real. Add to that a surging economy. Between 1920 and 1929, American industrial output nearly doubled. For the first time in history, ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy, could buy on credit. Department stores extended payment plans. Automobiles, once a luxury, were rolling off Henry Ford's assembly line in Highland Park, Michigan, at a pace that dropped the price of a Model T from $850 in 1908 to just $260 by 1924. The car didn't just change transportation, it changed geography, it changed courtship, it changed who you could be and where. Clara saves for months to ride in a friend's Ford out to Coney Island one Sunday afternoon in June. The salt wind off the Atlantic hits her face and she laughs out loud. And for a few hours the workshop is somewhere very far away. She buys a piece of saltwater taffy, sweet and chewy, pulling at her back teeth, and watches the ocean and tries to imagine what it looks like from one of those houses on Long Island's North Shore, where the lawns run down to the water and the lights never seem to go out. She has no idea. None of them do. The houses on the Gold Coast, that stretch of Long Island's North Shore from Great Neck out to Oyster Bay, were not merely large. They were something else entirely, something that America had never quite built before and has never quite built since. We step off the train at the Great Neck station, and the first thing we notice is the quiet. The jackhammers are gone. The coal smoke is gone. The air here smells of cut grass and salt water and something floral. Wisteria, maybe? Climbing a stone wall along the lane leading toward the water. It's warm, but there's a breeze off the Sound. And the light in late afternoon falls golden and sideways through trees that have been here for 100 years. The estates of the Gold Coast were built primarily between 1890 and 1930 by names that would have been known to every newspaper reader in America. Vanderbilt, Guggenheim, Frick, Pratt. The Vanderbilt estate at Centerport, called Eagle's Nest, sat on 43 acres. The Pratt family compound at Glen Cove contained multiple mansions, a golf course, and a private harbor. These weren't vacation homes. They were statements, architectural declarations of a new American aristocracy. One built not on inherited titles, but on inherited capital, which is perhaps the same thing with different paperwork. Many of these estates employed between 40 and 200 full-time staff members year-round. Gardeners, grooms, housemaids, cooks, chauffeurs, electricians, carpenters, boatmen. An entire economy of human labor hidden behind those hedgerows, keeping paradise running. The guests in white linen on the lawn at 4 in the afternoon had no need to think about any of it. That was, in a sense, the point. Walter knows this world from the service entrance. He makes deliveries twice a week. Cases of French champagne and Canadian whiskey in unmarked crates, carefully moved from a warehouse in Queens to garages on estates where nobody asks questions. He's seen things on those grounds that the newspapers will never print. He's also learned something essential. The people in those houses are no different from anyone else. They're just better insulated from consequence. Here is the contradiction beating at the heart of the 1920s, the one that Fitzgerald understood better than almost anyone. The entire golden decade was soaked in illegal alcohol. Prohibition had gone into effect on January 17, 1920, under the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors was now a federal crime. And within 18 months, it had become the most widely flouted law in American history. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It industrialized crime. By 1925, there were an estimated 30,000 speakeasies in New York City alone. More drinking establishments than had existed before Prohibition. The city's police force was hopelessly outmatched, and in many precincts, actively complicit. A 1926 investigation found that nearly a third of New York's police officers had accepted bribes from bootleggers at some point in the previous year. The money involved was staggering. Al Capone's Chicago operation was bringing in an estimated $60 million a year by 1927, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. And it wasn't just gangsters. Respectable businessmen, politicians, socialites, all of them drank, and all of them knew perfectly well where the bottles came from. The moral architecture of the law had been quietly dismantled, and in its place rose something more honest and more troubling. The understanding that rules applied to some people and not to others, depending on how much money was involved. Walter doesn't dwell on any of this philosophically. He just drives. But he notices, every time he pulls through the service gate of one of those estates, that the men carrying cases of champagne to the kitchen don't make eye contact with the guests on the lawn. An invisible line runs through the property. Everyone knows where it is. No one talks about it. Now we move inside. The parties themselves, the real ones, deserve their own chapter. The celebrations thrown by Long Island's wealthy in the 1920s were not casual gatherings. They were productions, orchestrated spectacles designed to communicate, in every possible sensory direction, the message that money was not a concern. That it had never been a concern. That concern itself was something that happened to other people. Step through the French doors and feel the temperature change immediately. The rooms are cooled by electric fans turning slowly in the ceilings, drawing the evening air off the sound. The floors are white marble imported from Italy, cool and faintly chalky underfoot. The tables are loaded. Cold lobster, shaved ham, deviled eggs, fruit carved into shapes that took a kitchen staff of 8 the better part of an afternoon to prepare. The air smells of gardenia and cigars and someone's heavy French perfume, and underneath it all, the sweet, sharp breath of open champagne bottles on silver trays. The band is playing something that makes standing still feel almost impossible. Not the slow, formal dance music of the previous decade. This is jazz. And in 1922, jazz still carries with it a charge of danger, of transgression. It came up from New Orleans and Chicago on the same railroads that brought Black Americans north during the Great Migration, and it brought with it rhythms and improvisations that the concert halls and parlors of old money had never quite been prepared for. Some of the guests at these parties loved it, precisely because their parents disapproved. The musicians at many of these elite Long Island parties were black artists who, after playing for hours in rooms full of white partygoers, were typically required to leave through the service entrance and were not permitted to mingle with the guests they had just performed for. The music that defined the Roaring Twenties was made possible by people the decade chose, almost entirely, to render invisible. James attends one of these parties in August, brought by a colleague from the Bond House. He stands at the edge of the room with a glass of something golden and watches the crowd. The women in drop-waist dresses with hemlines scandalously above the knee, the men in white dinner jackets, everyone laughing at a volume that suggests either enormous happiness or enormous effort. He can't quite tell which. He also notices that he doesn't recognize almost anyone here, and that almost everyone here seems to know each other very well. There are invisible walls in this room just as real as the ones outside. He just hasn't mapped them yet. And then there is the other Long Island, the one you pass through on the way from the city. Between Manhattan and the Gold Coast estates lies what Fitzgerald himself called the Valley of Ashes, a stretch of industrial wasteland in Queens along the Long Island Railroad corridor. In real life, this was the site of the Corona ash dumps, mountains of industrial ash and refuse, the byproduct of coal combustion from the furnaces of New York City, deposited here year after year until they formed soot-stained hills 20, 30 feet high. Clara passes through it on the train every time she visits her cousin in Jamaica, Queens. The train slows on that stretch, and she looks out the window at the ashen landscape. Men moving slowly through the gray dust, loading and shifting and pushing carts. Their faces and clothes and hands all turn the same pale color by the work. The smell seeps through the train windows even when they're closed. Sulfur, rot, the ancient mineral bitterness of things burned and discarded. These were real workers, many of them recent immigrants, many of them Black Americans who had migrated north seeking opportunity and found at the end of the journey that the opportunities available to them were very specifically bounded. They lived in company-owned housing near the dumps. They earned wages that kept them, year after year, within walking distance of the Pale Hills. Between those hills and the estates on the Sound, the distance was perhaps 15 miles. It might as well have been 1,500. This was the geography of the 1920s. Pleasure and waste, excess and exhaustion, laid out in plain sight along a single railroad line, and almost nobody willing to connect the two. The decade would not last. Everyone who lived through what came next would say later that there had been signs. The stock market had been running on speculation for years, not on the actual earnings of companies, but on the belief that prices would keep rising. Ordinary Americans had been buying stocks on margin, putting down 10% of the price and borrowing the rest, confident that the market only moved in one direction. By the summer of 1929, the total value of outstanding margin loans was larger than the entire amount of currency in circulation in the United States. The crash, when it came in October 1929, didn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It arrived like a tide going out, slowly at first, then all at once. In 4 days, between October 24th and October 29th, the market lost 25% of its value. Fortunes evaporated. Banks called in loans. Businesses that had borrowed against paper assets found themselves with nothing. The estates on the Gold Coast began one by one to go dark. The parties ended. Yes, many of those great Long Island mansions were demolished not in the 1930s, but in the 1950s, because no one could afford to maintain them, and the property taxes on empty palaces were ruinous. Of the roughly 1,000 estates that once lined Nassau and Suffolk counties, fewer than 200 survive today. The rest were torn down, their marble floors and French windows and manicured lawns swallowed by subdivision developments and shopping strips. The dream didn't fade. It was bulldozed. James leaves New York in 1931. He doesn't go back to Minnesota. He goes to Philadelphia, where a cousin has found him a bookkeeping job at a small manufacturing firm. He rides the train out of Penn Station on a gray November morning and doesn't look back. The bond firm closed 2 years ago. The colleague who brought him to that party on Long Island lost everything in the crash, and the last James heard was selling insurance door to door in New Jersey. He carries a copy of a novel with him on that train. A book that had come out in 1925, when the parties were still happening, that he hadn't quite understood at the time. He understands it now. He reads a few pages as the train moves through Queens, past the soot-stained hills and the colorless men still moving slowly through the dust, and he thinks, Fitzgerald saw all of it. He saw it while it was happening, which is the rarest and most painful kind of vision. The green light at the end of the dock, the dream that was always just out of reach, the beautiful and the damned dancing above a hollow floor. This was the world F. Scott Fitzgerald knew firsthand. The Jazz Age parties, the bootlegger's fortune, the Valley of Ashes, the specific American delusion that the future is always just across the water, and that wanting it badly enough is the same as deserving it. He poured all of it, every smell and sound and moral contradiction, into every page of The Great Gatsby. The novel survived the decade that made it. The decade did not. If this journey through the real world behind one of America's greatest novels spoke to you, please leave a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who love history told this way. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next.